Chapter 4 A Puppy for James. At the school assembly the next day, Mandy sat down next to Sarah Drummond. Sarah was in her class. James was sitting behind them. He leaned over and spoke to Mandy. "I've been reading the book you gave me," he said. "It's going to be great having a puppy. I think Labradors are the smartest dogs in the world." "Are you getting a puppy?" said Sarah. "So am I." Mandy turned to her. "I didn't know you liked dogs," she said. Sarah put her nose in the air. "This isn't just any puppy," she said. "It's a pedigree." Mandy bit her lip. "All puppies are special," she said. "It doesn't matter whether they're crossbreeds or pedigrees. They're all animals." "Shh," said James. "Listen." Mandy looked up. Mrs. Garvey, the principal, was standing on the platform at the front of the hall. "Before you go to class," she said, "I have an announcement to make. We've decided that the last day of the semester will be Pet Day." There was a murmur of voices as the students turned to one another excitedly. Mrs. Garvey held up her hand for silence. "All of you will be able to bring your pets to school that day," she smiled, "just as long as we don't have any dangerous animals." "Like tigers," said Peter Foster from the row in front of Mandy. "No tigers, please, Peter. Timmy will be enough of a handful," Mrs. Garvey said, and everybody laughed. Peter turned bright red. Timmy was Peter's Cairn Terrier, and he was the naughtiest dog in town. "Oh, excellent," said James. "I'll be able to bring my new puppy." Sarah looked at him. "And I'll be able to bring mine," she said. "I bet mine will be nicer than yours." She looked at Mandy. "Do you have a pet?" Mandy suddenly felt sad. "No," she said. "I don't have a pet of my own." Sarah looked surprised. "Really?" she said. "Imagine living at Animal Ark and not having a pet. I feel sorry for you." Mandy bit her lip. Sarah didn't sound sorry for her, but Mandy didn't say anything to Sarah. Mrs. Garvey warned the children to keep out of the way of the builders who were coming to work on the auditorium. Then she announced the end of assembly. Everybody got up to go. "Sarah doesn't really feel sorry for me," Mandy said to James as they filed out of the room. James looked at Mandy. "Don't be upset about Sarah," he said. "She didn't mean it." Mandy tried to smile, but she still felt sad. "Sometimes I wish I had a pet of my own," she said. James smiled. "You've got a whole ark full of pets," he said. "Maybe your mom and dad would let you bring one of them?" Mandy shook her head. "Oh, no," she said. "They wouldn't let me do that. All the animals at Animal Ark are patients." "Oh," said James. Mandy smiled. "But you'll have a pet to bring," she said. "You'll have your very own puppy by the end of the semester." "It's not far now," said Dr. Emily as the car swung around a bend on the road to Moorcroft Farm. James was trying to look relaxed, but Mandy could see that he was really excited and nervous. Dr. Emily looked around. "I hope Benji won't be jealous when you bring a puppy home," she said. James looked worried. "Do you think he will be?" he asked. Dr. Emily shrugged. "Maybe you should keep him away from the puppy for a little while," she said. "Benji's bound to be protective of his own territory. After all, he's been the only pet in your house for a long time now. But they'll soon get used to each other." "I hope so," said James. "I wouldn't like Benji to feel bad." "He won't," said Mandy. "Just make sure you don't ignore him when the new puppy arrives." "You might even have to pay more attention to him than you usually do," said Dr. Emily. "That's no problem," James said. "I like playing with Benji." The car turned onto the road that led to Moorcroft. "Oh, look," said Mandy, pointing to a car parked in the farmyard. "That isn't Mrs. Lawson's car. I wonder whose it is." "Maybe someone else has come to look at the puppies," Dr. Emily said. Dr. Emily stopped the car, and Mandy and James jumped out. "Let's go see," said Mandy. She raced across the farmyard toward the house. "Wait for me," James called, running after her. "Mrs. Lawson, we're here!" Mandy shouted, knocking on the back door. Mrs. Lawson came to meet them. She was a friendly-looking lady with gray hair and an old tweed shirt. "So I see," she said, smiling. "Come on into the back kitchen. Molly's there with her puppies. And don't make too much noise. She's already had one visitor today." Mandy immediately clapped a hand to her mouth. "Sorry," she whispered. "Are the puppies asleep?" Mrs. Lawson grinned. "They're only a few days old," she said. "Puppies that age are usually asleep. When they aren't eating, that is." Mandy and James tiptoed after her into the farmhouse's warm kitchen. "There you are," said Mrs. Lawson. Mandy and James looked where she was pointing. A big wicker basket was next to the bright red stove, and Molly was curled up in it. As she lifted her head toward them, Mandy got her first glimpse of the puppies, snuggled up close to their mother. "Oh, look, James," she said, walking softly across the floor to the basket. "Aren't they wonderful?" James came and stood beside her, looking down at the puppies. 5 tiny balls of black fur were curled up against their mother. One of them yawned, and Mandy could see his little pink tongue, but he kept his eyes closed tightly. "Their eyes won't open for another week yet," said Mrs. Lawson. "Oh, look," said Mandy. "Look at that tiny one, the one that just yawned. Isn't he sweet?" Mrs. Lawson came to stand beside her. "I was worried about him at first," she said, "but he's a strong little fellow. He's going to be all right." "Is that the one Mom was talking about?" said Mandy. "The smallest one of the litter?" Mrs. Lawson nodded. "He might be little, but he's a real character," she said. "He's got a really friendly nature." "Are we allowed to touch the puppies?" James asked. Mrs. Lawson smiled. "Of course," she said. James bent down and gazed at the smallest puppy. He stretched out a finger and touched the puppy very gently. The little animal gave a tiny squeak. "Did you hear that?" said James. "He said hello." Mrs. Lawson laughed. "He certainly did, James." James turned with a giant grin on his face to Mandy. "I know which one I want," he said. "Just as long as it's not the one I want," said a voice from the door. Mandy and James turned around. Sarah Drummond was standing there. "My mom wants to have a word with you, Mrs. Lawson," she said. Mrs. Lawson nodded and walked toward the door. "Are you adopting one of Molly's puppies too?" Mandy asked Sarah. Sarah nodded. "I'm getting the biggest one," she said. "He's beautiful." James smiled. "That's okay then," he said. "The one I want is the smallest of them all." Mrs. Lawson looked back at him from the doorway. "Are you sure?" she said. "He'll be a little more work than a big one. You'll need to feed him more often, for starters." "How often?" asked Mandy. 5 times a day to begin with," said Mrs. Lawson. "Puppies need lots of milk and high-protein food to help them grow." James looked worried. "How will I know what kind of food to give him?" he said. "I'll give you a diet sheet," said Mrs. Lawson. "Puppies aren't so very different from human babies. They need just as much care and attention. You start them off on milk, and then go on to a little cereal, and after that you can introduce some fish and meat scraps. But they are a lot of work. Are you sure you can handle it?" James pushed his glasses up his nose and nodded. "I'm sure," he said. "And this is the puppy I want. I couldn't have any other. He's perfect." "And I'll help James look after him," said Mandy. Mrs. Lawson smiled. "Well, good for you, James," she said. "I think you've made a very good choice there." And she went out of the room. Sarah looked down into the basket. "That little thing?" she said. "Wait until pet day. I bet my puppy is twice as big as yours by then." Mandy turned to her and smiled. "They'll both be adorable," she said. But Sarah shook her head. "Mine will be much nicer," she said, "and you won't even have a pet to bring to pet day." Mandy's face fell, and James stepped forward. "Oh, yes, she will," he said. Sarah and Mandy looked at him in surprise. "You know I won't," Mandy said. "What pet?" said Sarah. James looked down at the puppy he had chosen. "My puppy," he said. "Mandy's going to help me look after him. We'll share him. We'll both bring him to pet day." Sarah looked annoyed, but Mandy smiled and gave James a grateful look. "Oh, James," she said, "are you sure? Can I really share the puppy with you?" "Of course you can," James said. How am I going to learn how to look after him without your help?" Mandy looked down at Molly. "There, Molly," she said. "I'm going to be looking after one of your puppies. Isn't that great?" "Sharing a pet?" said Sarah. "Who ever heard of that?" And she stomped out of the room.